Hi there, this is Elise Bennin, your marketing mentor. And this is the podcast for you if and only if you are ready to leave the feast or famine syndrome behind, and I mean for good. Welcome to the 500th episode of the Marketing Mentor Podcast. I do plan to do a reflective episode to look back and see how we got here, but this is not that episode. In fact, this episode is looking forward into a future that is rushing toward us. Yes, I am talking about AI, artificial intelligence. I am bullish on AI. I am fascinated by all the different things it means already and will mean. And my mantra these days is, no matter what kind of work you do, adapt and adopt. I'm super curious about how it will change my world and the world of my clients, lots of creative professionals. In fact, I'm a little obsessed lately by how we can use AI to find clients. And that's why I'm offering a free webinar called Potential Clients on Tap with AI. That'll be on Wednesday, May 29th from 12 to 1 p.m. Eastern. I'll share more details at the end of today's episode, but you can also sign up by going to marketing-mentor.com. The link is in the announcement bar at the top of the homepage. But back to today's episode, which is a conversation with Deborah Brozina. She is an Emmy-nominated filmmaker who runs Making Change Productions. And the headline on her LinkedIn profile says, I help nonprofits and mission-driven firms deliver targeted content that improves engagement by 2.6x. Deb is also a longtime colleague and a current member of the Simplest Marketing Plan. And she's been aware of AI for many years, in fact, since she was in engineering school at Cornell. And in this conversation, she shares her experience and her perspective on AI, especially for creatives. So listen and learn. All right, welcome, Deb, to the podcast.
Thanks, Elise. It's great to hear from you.
Yes. Go ahead and introduce yourself first. Please give us your elevator pitch.
Sure. So I run Making Change Productions. We create content for mission-driven organizations. And that I mean NGOs and nonprofits, but it's not always NGOs and nonprofits. And we bring creative and technical talent that has worked at the peak of global media to bring clear messages that really powerfully connect to targeted audiences. I work in the film and television industry, and I've got a heavy network of talent that I bring to solve this kind of content strategy and ongoing content creation for NGOs.
And so what kind of content are we talking about? Which media?
So it can be everything from websites to thought leadership pieces to their social media feeds, web video for them, video campaigns for them. We've done all of it.
And I invited you onto the podcast because you are a member of the SMP, the Simplest Marketing Plan, and you come to every office hours meeting and you always speak up, which I really appreciate because a lot of people don't. And you often have something to say or a good question to ask. And in this most recent one, you were asking and talking about AI. We were focused on AI a lot. And I just wanted to give you an opportunity to share a little bit more about your perspective and how you're thinking about it and your experience. So maybe start with your experience with AI.
Sure. So for me, it's been front of mind for the last 2 years from my camera side. We have seen this coming, and obviously dealing with the writers and the actors strike, it was a significant component of their negotiations, and the International Alliance of Theatrical and Stage Employees is, as we are speaking, negotiating their next 3-year contract, and it is a significant issue for us. So we've learned a lot about it, but for me, this actually goes back to engineering school. I studied operations research and information engineering at Cornell. And what operations research is it is this foundational element of it. It is the ability to make a better decision in a random environment. where you have multiple things going on, all of them are random. How do you actually sift through this information to make a good decision predictably? You wouldn't have Amazon and its logistics ability without that. You wouldn't have FedEx or the airline industry. So this has been around for a really long time. So when I start looking at things like ChatGPT and Sora is the big threat to the visual industry. That's the one that is video generation.
Mm-hmm.
And when Tyler Perry saw Sora, he canceled an $800 million studio expansion in Atlanta because he knew how transformative this would be to the video and film industry. He didn't know how it was going to work, but we knew we were playing with something that would change the way we would work.
And did you think that made sense when he did that?
At the moment, yeah, I do actually. I had done some statistical modeling probably about 10, 12 years ago about how to reduce the costs of TV pilots. And if we can actually shorten our development cycle, anything to shorten the development cycle in the film and television industry, it has a significant impact on it. I don't think it was the only reason he canceled it. Certainly not, because there's been a lot of underlying business model shifts with streaming. So it was just, I think he canceled it because of the level of uncertainty that this has introduced.
So let's talk about, just lay a foundation of what AI really is from your experience and your perspective, because I think we throw that term around, artificial intelligence, and it means so many different things to so many different people. So tell us from your point of view what it is and how it works.
Yeah, so it's really important to cut through the tech hype cycle here. We've seen this, if you've been around for more than a minute and a half, you've seen the tech hype cycle. But what AI is it's fundamentally, I would call it a statistical model, but it's a little ahead of that. Statistics can be used to guess the future and also tell you, what the past was. This is really stochastic, where it's randomness, it's modeling randomness, and it is nothing is determined. Everything has a likelihood. So, in physics, you learn the basic equation of F equals ma. Well, if you're looking at it from a stochastic perspective, you'd go, yeah, most of the time. It has likelihoods, what's likely to happen next. And within AI, it will randomize even that. It is also multivariate. What it means is it's looking at many, many, many different variables at the same time as it's making its decisions.
Would you say, because often it feels like AI knows certain things, would you say AI doesn't know anything?
Correct. Correct. It's guessing. It's saying, yeah, probably that. It doesn't actually know anything. And that's really, what you just said is a really important concept to get. So we'll go into some of the EU legislation, but at the beginning of March of 2024, the EU started to put some very serious legislation around this. And they actually created a definition of it, where it is a tool that operates with varying levels of autonomy. And that is a big difference. It infers, based on what you tell it, what input you give it, how to generate the output. It has the capacity to infer. So it's guessing things. And
let me just stop you there, because I think often people confuse imply and infer. I remember learning it, but define infer just for those who.
So I actually don't have a formal definition of imply, but you can hint at something being true in imply, but infer is it's taking the data and saying, okay, if this is two, if the sequence of numbers is 1, 2, 3, I'm going to likely guess that your next one is 4. It's going to infer where you're going.
Okay.
So, but in this case, it's going to say, I've got 7 different variables. I'm going to guess what you're going to say next.
Which of these 7 options it could be.
Exactly. It has the ability to make a decision that's going to influence a physical or a virtual environment. And it exhibits adaptiveness after deployment. And for me, that is the really big difference. The tool itself will learn from what it is doing. Now, we've had machine learning for a long time, but we normally keep that in the lab. This is now released into the wild. So it's going to adapt based on what it sees over time.
And, one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you is because you seemed very alarmed about
Yeah.
how people were using and talking about AI just in the office hours for the Simplest Marketing Plan. And I have noticed that the people who have no experience of it, who were just introduced to it, when ChatGPT hit the scene in November 2022, which is how everyone remembers it,
Right.
they're very excited and no one is alarmed. But if you've been in AI for any amount of time, those are the people who seem the most alarmed about what's going on with it. So I don't know, speak to that if you would.
Oh God, there's so many reasons to be alarmed. To give you an idea, like, first off, how were these machine models trained? What were they trained on? Right. I've watched a friend of mine who works in my industry go to ChatGPT and say, write me an email in the language of George R.R. Martin that discusses, I forget what the whole thing was. And well, how did it learn from George R.R. Martin? It took George R.R. Martin's material. Well, that's copyrighted material. So even in the process of training ChatGPT, it's based on theft and theft of creative property. So that was problem number one for me.
And, we're not going to debate that issue here because neither of us are a lawyer, but I know that there are lots of lawsuits pending or in process about this in the first place. So, and we don't know what's going to happen with that. But okay, so that's one of the issues of alarm.
Right. So let me also go into the difference between predictive and generative, and that might help a lot. So there's predictive. It's saying these models have been around for a long time. You can look at it as like any kind of logistical issue is going to predict where a package needs to go next and the best way of getting it there. Sometimes it's a little less problematic, but it can still be problematic. Because back in the day, when I first did this, when I was in grad school, we had to we had to figure out based on a massive data set what was a likely good pricing for a bank for its retail customers. And fortunately, I had really good bosses who said, guys, you have to be able to do this and prove that you're coming to the same conclusion from two independent paths. The problem with AI is there's no independent path to double check their work. If you give AI the same input twice, it is not necessarily going to come out with the same output twice.
Yeah, I think a lot of people have noticed that.
Yes. So, and you cannot trace forwards or backwards. So it's a bit of an issue in predictive, depending on how the use case is. Like, okay, well, are you going to predict a course of treatment medically for this person? What happens if it's random how they've decided it? So, you got issues there. Generative is where I really see the problem, and this is where the EU has really cracked down. So first off, you can't copyright AI material. So if you're using it and you are trying to produce something that will generate revenue, you can't, because a copyright has to have human authorship. You cannot ensure uniqueness of what you've produced because it's spit out other things, and you have no knowledge of how it's introduced a bias or how you're going to check against biases. And personally, the content I've seen coming out of it hasn't really been that good. Mm-hmm. Like, it might get you started, but nobody should be releasing that into the wild yet.
So basically, we're saying whatever output you get from these generative AI platforms, you have to obviously not use as is and
Correct.
check, but also add your own ideas and spin and language. And then if you did use it, for example, to create an outline, I've heard people ask this question, and then you turn it into something your own, is that copyrightable? Do you know? Again, we're not lawyers.
I don't know that one yet. And that, I think, is legally has to be decided. So, a lot of the reason why people with knowledge of the tools or knowledge of how tools are generated are freaking out is because we saw what happened with social media. And
Which
that
is
is
what?
why, well, I think we've seen a lot of negative consequences from social media. Social media shows you what it wants to see based on an algorithm. To some degree, that algorithm learns, but it's usually just tweaked in the background. So we've seen distortions in the impact on teenagers, the impact on our public discourse, and potentially some very large disinformation and misinformation. So the real concern is now what happens when that algorithm is adapting real time to
Mhm.
what it's seeing, and we can't control that.
And I have heard people say that the goal here, can we learn from the social media experience and prevent AI from going down that same path? It sounds like that's what you're talking about.
Yeah, I think that's really where you're hearing so much of the concern is the difference is, at least with social media, to some degree, humans are writing those algorithms
Mm-hmm.
and are still responsible for those algorithms. They're whether we've held them responsible or not is a different story, but they are responsible. And there's enough distrust in what has occurred through social media that there's actually research, certainly for nonprofits, that if a donor finds out that an image or a piece of content was generated by AI, they lose trust in the organization that sent that image or piece of content.
Mm-hmm.
So that is, I think, something that in the creative professions we have to be mindful of if we're doing it on behalf of another organization. And to give you an idea, Dove produced one AI generated ad to prove a point.
Dove meaning the soap.
The soap, exactly. Unilever.
Mm-hmm.
They will not use AI in their ads. And because they've got 20 years of brand equity in that Real Beauty campaign that they would lose immediately if they were working with AI to generate those images.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a healthy skepticism, I think, about it. And then the EU set rules around it, around data quality, transparency, oversight, and also, and this is, I think, something relative for people in the US who might have clients who are using this globally. If that material gets distributed within the EU, then you are still liable for what happens with that material, regardless of where that material originated. And the fines are very substantial. It's 7% of global revenue
Mm-hmm.
if they find you. I think the good thing here is they've taken it and put it on a risk-based model. So they're not saying don't use it. I think this is really a helpful framework. And I really hope people dive into trying to understand where the legislators were coming from with this. They've broken it out into sort of unacceptable, high risk, limited risk, and minimal risk. So the unacceptable stuff is anything that will manipulate human behavior. So that includes emotional recognition, real-time categorization, biometrics, and then, high risk stuff, which is energy and transport, medical, or access to something. That's not likely, the creative audience is going to be dealing with. We are on the edge of the unacceptable stuff if we are using it to create, for example, video campaigns to affect an election. That is, or to affect whether or not somebody applies for particular jobs, or it's still got to be legislated and cleared out. And I haven't actually I've read the commentary around the legislation, but I haven't settled in for a good pot of tea and a deep read of this yet.
Mm-hmm. And I doubt most people will, right? I mean, you're
exactly.
unusual in that sense, I would think.
Exactly. Well, I hold dual citizenship between the US and EU, and I'm Estonian, and our government is fully digital. So that's why I vote electronically. I do everything electronically. I think the only thing I can't do is buy property and get divorced. And I think they solved the property problem.
Interesting.
Yeah. So it's all based on trust. And that's really what it's trying to take care of. So I think it can be used responsibly, and people really do need to understand the risks involved here to just do things ethically. So, for example, at the conference I was just at, there's a whole lot of discussion about ethical storytelling for nonprofits. How long do you continue to use the story of somebody who may have experienced homelessness? It's now 7, 8, 9, 10 years later, they're no longer in that situation. Are you still using their image and things like that? Well, if I have put that image on social media, that image may have been consumed by an AI engine right now. And, that is, I know for my arts and culture clients, we are very concerned about putting stuff now out on social media. It was always a risk, but the risk was confined to somebody like downloading the image. Well, now it's that image has been consumed to create something else.
Mm-hmm.
So I know of I have not recommended putting any original piece of art, any image of that hasn't been protected in some way with a watermark, or there's a new tool, I haven't had a chance to test it yet, that would effectively somehow ruin ingestion. But that said, I'm also looking at storyboarding apps, and that could make a big difference when I'm going to do a video, and shot listing apps.
Mm-hmm.
And I was in a session 3 weeks ago where we were talking about doing color correction of images that might make it a whole lot easier for us, and being able to real-time color correct images. So there are some,
and those are AI
uses,
tools, you're saying,
and those are AI tools. So it's not that we don't want to use it at all, but there's got to be a responsible use for it. And right now, everybody I know is just testing them. They're not actually deploying them.
So what are your recommendations then for working creatives? And let's define creative, because you're coming at it from, it sounds to me like, especially a very visual perspective.
Yes.
And I have a lot of, let's call them literal creatives
right.
who are listeners as well. So
right.
I don't know, maybe make those distinctions if you could.
So I think the same issue exists for writers as it does for visual people. It does seem in the very preliminary research that the visual folks are a little more scrutinized when this is going on. It's really hard to unravel something that has had some AI in it. So like if I'm using it for color correction, that's one thing. But if I'm using it to generate the original image, that's another thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's not possible to undo that original image generation. Whereas if you're using ChatGPT to get you to a first draft, by the time you're really done with it, it probably doesn't look like anything that ChatGPT really did spit out. And certainly with my experience of it. So right now, I would say do not release anything into the wild. Mm-hmm. The legal risks are also not worth it. Because if you're generating something on behalf of a brand and it is found later, because we are in the middle of legally sorting this stuff out, and it's found out later that you should not have done that, you are liable for that. And we also don't know the very legality of the underlying tools themselves. So I would be extremely cautious with using it. I have found it's good for search if you don't know what to search for.
Well, let's talk about that, because that's really where I'm thinking about and playing around with using it for research, marketing research. So
that's exactly where it's good for.
Yeah, talk to me about that. What do you know about that? What do you think is helpful? What are the best prompts? Whatever you can say.
So I know you had made the suggestion of take 3 targets, 3 great prospects, and run them through ChatGPT and tell me what the commonalities are.
Mm-hmm. What we have in common.
What we have in common.
We want to be able to reach out and say something like, here's how we're connected.
Right. So when I do content strategy and I'm just defining user personas, I like a lot of precision and detail in those things. And it's just part of how Making Change approaches it. Lots of detail helps get very specific. Well, instead of having to rely on my donor, my client's base, for example, I can actually run a whole bunch of things through there to say, well, what do these, 75 people have in common? Long run, I'm looking at some kind of tool like that, because I can right now, if you do the paid version of ChatGPT, I'll take a link. I can say, here's 20 LinkedIn profiles. What do I have in common here? Now, that's not going to solve all of my problem because it doesn't do anything, but I can go, okay, it's X number of years in the profession. It's, they tend to live here. I can get some of that information and it might be slightly more valid. because this is falling into the predictive category of AI. I think that's very useful. I've also been in situations where I've had to research a topic, when it's a very scientific client, for example. I don't even know where to start Googling, or I start Googling and I end up in PubMed and it's like really large words I don't understand and not going to understand. This can actually put it into English that I can understand. So
it can translate essentially or interpret for you.
It gets me enough that I can then go and do a Google search that becomes useful to me.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's definitely an application for it. Where I'm really finding is, and this was eye-opening for me last week at the conference, where people were real-time trying to do something with ChatGPT and ChatGPT-4, where it took links. I asked the question, well, out of this material that you now spent 20 minutes and didn't get to anything useful, have you tested this to see whether or not it is actually engaging at the level that a human written piece is? And have you kept track of how much time it took you to create that content using ChatGPT versus if you hadn't done it at all? So I think at this point, for the writers and the photographers and the folks, is like, really start to track your time on the various components that it takes for you to create your content, whether that's a blog post or an image. Get a sense of what those steps are, get a sense of how much time each step takes. And then when you're experimenting, go against it. And most importantly, check to see whether or not it actually engages people at the same level. Right. So you've got a lot of testing to do.
That's interesting. And actually, it kind of leads nicely into the last question that I always ask, which is, what is a baby step that people can take to start moving in this direction? If someone is maybe confused about the risks and not sure if they should use AI for this or that, what's a baby step someone could take?
For a lot of people, it's really simple, of just going to ChatGPT or what's the Microsoft one, which I found was actually not bad either.
Bing?
Bing, yeah. And start with a Google search and play. Mm-hmm. Take an approach of play. So let's say you are in a bad mood and you want to send a nasty gram. Go and just, in the style of Shakespeare, write me a "do never talk to me again" email. So you take the pressure off. It's never going to be something you're going to use, but you start to break the ice with it, because I think there's now also a scare factor with it that people need to move. And then once you're past that, like, I won't even log into it stage, when you log into it, take a piece of, if it's a standard, hey, I'll be able to schedule this in a week email, or something that's a standard process for you, and really see if it can refine it. Take something that how you would approach the problem and see what it does, and if it does anything better for you. I would add one other thing, especially for the visual people. You're going to need all of your releases to be rewritten, and all of your contracts will have to be rewritten. So, again, that's why I'm recommending, unless you're prepared to go and do that right now, now's the time for playing with it. Mm-hmm. For me, I have a big thought piece I have to write. So I want to sit down and say, all right, I need some background for it. This is where I'm going to put it into the research/writing mode. And I'm going to start to see what it's saying and how it's saying it. I'll play a little bit with tone. One tip I did pick up is, if you are using these things, it's really helpful to praise or criticize it at each new prompt. It learns. Mm-hmm. So it's okay to tell it, that was awful.
Good girl, bad girl.
Exactly. That was great. Really great start. I like this, but now can we do this? And it will take the praise and it will take the criticism, because it is actually starting to get trained on the emotional side of it, which of course is where, you're straying into challenging parts of the tool. But hey, if it's used for research, it can help.
Yeah. Okay. I actually have two more questions,
Yeah,
and then I'll ask you to give people where they can find you online.
sure.
Um, and this will be my second question. If you have a favorite platform, you've mentioned ChatGPT a couple times, but is that your favorite? But don't answer that yet because the first one is a little bit more thoughtful. I just find for myself that when I want to write something, when I have a new idea, I want to do the thinking. If I get the AI to help me with the thinking or even the ideating, I feel like I've missed out on a really important, to me at least, aspect of the process that will probably, I'll have to pay for it later on down the road. And I just feel like it's almost like a digestive process,
Hmm.
that an absorption process that I just love. Like that's the creative process for me. And I don't want to outsource any of the creative process. So I don't know if you have an opinion about that.
Well, let me make sure I understand what you mean about that upfront thinking. Is it like the how you're going to be expressing it, or is it the research into the underlying thing, like what your perspective is on it?
It's the latter. It's more about what my perspective is and what I think. And it's kind of me taking ideas from a movie I watched the other night and a book I'm reading and a podcast I heard and finding that common denominator, which is the kernel of the idea that I want to find a way to articulate and pass along to my people.
Yeah, I don't think that really helps. I don't think the AI helps in that area. I think it can actually lead you astray. I tried it a couple of times when I was trying to get the right tone for something, which it turned out I was actually looking for my perspective on. Um,
Interesting.
yeah, it showed up as the problem of like, okay, so how am I going to write this in the right tone? And it turned out I hadn't really fully articulated how
Yeah.
I what I wanted to say.
Yeah.
I don't think for me, the only process for that is I literally have to take pen to paper. It has
Yeah.
to be one of the oldest technologies known to humankind.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's replaced that. We are really at an early stage of this as well.
Yeah.
It's going to learn very fast. So I think that's why we have to stay in touch with it.
Mhm.
But I don't think it's going to replace in any near time that quality work.
Mhm.
If you're producing clickbait, have at it, but
Right.
it's going to be clickbait, right? And that's not what you or your listeners or the people who hang out with you are there for. And I think we're going to be much more discerning in our content going forward because of this. It's
That's
going to
a
just produce
beautifully,
even more.
yeah, that's a beautifully positive idea to end on. Thank
Yeah.
you, Deb. And tell us, do you have a favorite platform or tool?
Well, for social media, it's Instagram, and you can find me at Deb Film.
Mhm.
I am still surviving on Twitter for reasons that elude me. But the feed has become more dog and cat videos, so I deal with it. And you can find me there at Brozina. And you can find me at Making Change, making-change.net.
Excellent. And do you have a favorite AI tool?
Not yet, because there's
Okay.
there's one or two that I'm actually haven't had an opportunity to experiment with, but they might become my favorites if they
Mhm.
actually work. I'm actually looking at storyboards, and there's one that was created by a colleague of mine, Leland Crane, called Shot List,
Hmm.
and he's working on that. So those I think are actually super useful tools that I don't think will cause massive problems for anybody, and they would really help clarify our process. So I'm looking forward to diving into those two.
Excellent. All right. Thank you so much, Deb, for bringing this to me, these ideas, and sharing what you've learned. And I will see you at the next office hours.
Absolutely. See you then.
I do hope you learned a little something from Deb that will help you navigate these new waters. I know I did. And as I mentioned in our conversation, my focus is on using AI for research. I really think it can expand and deepen and personalize the search for your ideal clients, the ones who are the best fit for you, the ones who appreciate the unique value that you bring to your work. And that's what I'll be sharing on Wednesday, May 29th from 12 to 1 p.m. Eastern at my free webinar. It's called Potential Clients on Tap with AI. And I will also be previewing a new live course. So there's a link to sign up for the free webinar in the show notes, or simply go to marketing-mentor.com and click on the link in the announcement bar at the top of the homepage. I hope to see you there. And as always, if you want to build a thriving business on your own terms, the first step is always to sign up for my quick tips at marketing-mentortips.com. Once you're on the site, you'll find lots more resources, including my simplest marketing plan. So enjoy, and I'll see you next time.